Did you draft Mark Andrews this year? Then buckle up, because a major red flag just dropped, and his name is right in the middle of it. One of the biggest stars on the Ravens was just called one of the most overvalued fantasy assets for 2025, and the reason behind it has a lot of people doing a double take. Yeah, he led all tight ends in touchdowns last year, but analysts are pointing to some serious red flags in his numbers and signs that the decline may already be happening. And what makes this worse? There's a new name in Baltimore that could be gunning for his spot. So the real question is Mark Andrews still that guy? Or are fantasy managers about to get burned in week 1? If you've been playing fantasy for a while, you probably won a few matchups thanks to Mark Andrews. He's been that steady, reliable red zone threat who always came through when you needed him most. But now, with the regular season around the corner, some major voices in the fantasy world are saying it's time to hit the brakes. And this isn't coming from some random blog. Bleacher Report just listed him as one of the top 4 most overvalued fantasy players this year. That's a big deal. They grouped him in with names like Josh Allen, Saquon Barkley, and Tyreek Hill. This isn't about talent. It's about value. Andrews is still getting drafted pretty high, with managers expecting the same elite production from years past. But the warning signs are piling up. And as every fantasy player knows, one bad early pick can ruin your whole season before it even starts. The main issue? Return on investment. Andrews is still respected, sure, but is he really worth where he's being drafted? According to fantasy analyst Gary Davenport, not anymore. His current form doesn't match his past reputation, and fantasy doesn't care what you did last year, especially when the first few games leave a bad taste. And that slow start in 2024, it's still haunting his outlook heading into this season. It's easy to look back and see the 11 touchdowns Mark Andrews scored last season. That was more than any other tight end. But here's what people forget. He started 2024 ice cold. In his first 4 games, Andrews had just 6 catches for 65 yards total. That's shockingly low for a guy of his caliber. And in fantasy, how you start the season matters a lot. If you draft someone to be your weekly starter and they flop for a month straight, you're already playing catch-up. And when it's a tight end, where the position is already thin, that hurts even more. That's why, even with those 11 touchdowns by the end of the season, fantasy managers are nervous. They're not sure he can consistently produce at a top-tier level anymore. And here's the thing, that touchdown total might have been an outlier. Analysts like Corey Piper have pointed out that touchdown spikes rarely repeat, especially with veteran players. If Andrews doesn't hit double digits again, his fantasy value could tank fast. He's still a big name, but recent trends say he's far from a sure thing. And if that wasn't enough, there's someone else in the Ravens' locker room turning up the heat. While doubts started creeping about Andrews, Isaiah Likely's stock is on the rise. The young Ravens tight end has impressed every time he's been given a chance. He plays fast, smooth, and looks like a perfect fit for today's NFL. He's not the full-time starter yet, but if you follow the Ravens closely, you can feel it. Likely is coming. With Baltimore's offense evolving and leaning more into variety and explosiveness, there's a real chance Likely starts eating into Andrews' role more than people expect. He's already earned Lamar Jackson's trust in key situations, and in fantasy, that's a huge red flag. When tight ends start splitting targets, neither of them hits their ceiling, but the one you drafted early is the one you regret. And let's not ignore the bigger picture here. The Ravens just added Derrick Henry. Zay Flowers is gaining steam. Rashad Bateman's healthy. The days of the offense funneling through Mark Andrews might be over. And if he's not dominating targets anymore, it's simple. He's not worth his current fantasy price. And that brings us to one of the biggest traps in all of fantasy football. Aging tight ends with outlier stat lines.
All right, we're already past the halfway point of this video. But before we continue, I noticed you haven't left a like yet. It's really important because it helps YouTube keep showing you my content so I can keep bringing you the best news about the Baltimore Ravens. So go ahead and hit that like button. It's free and it really helps. Thanks. Now let's get back to it.
Fantasy veterans know this too well. Chasing last year's touchdown totals is a dangerous game. Mark Andrews looked great on paper in 2024, but most of that came from 11 touchdowns, not consistent weekly production. And when touchdowns are your only source of upside, your floor is dangerously low. That kind of spike rarely happens again, especially for a player on the wrong side of the age curve. In fantasy, the edge often goes to the younger, more explosive talent. Andrews isn't washed, but the drop in his average draft position to TE7 says a lot. The market is already adjusting. Maybe it's time fantasy managers did the same. Tight end is also one of the hardest positions to get right in fantasy football. It's either boom or bust. You land a unicorn like Kelsey, or you're stuck with 5 points a week. And spending an early pick on someone who doesn't have guaranteed volume or weekly reliability is a risk that can sink your team fast. And even though Andrews still carries weight in the Ravens locker room, that doesn't always translate into fantasy success. Let's be clear, Mark Andrews is still a big part of this Ravens team. He's respected, he's a leader, and he's part of what makes Baltimore's offense work. But real-life value and fantasy value, two very different things. And right now, his fantasy hype feels a lot bigger than what the numbers actually support. The Ravens are loaded. Lamar is still Lamar. Derrick Henry's in the mix. The receiving core is deep, and Baltimore has one of the most dangerous rosters in the NFL. But when fantasy points are on the line, it's all about consistency, target share, and production. And lately, Andrews has been shaky in all three. So if you're holding on to Andrews hoping he'll be that locked-in top 5 tight end again, you might be banking more on name than performance. He'll have some big games, sure, but over the course of the season, it's looking more and more like he might not be the guy to build your roster around anymore. Look, there's no denying what Mark Andrews has meant to the Ravens and to fantasy football, but the red flags are real. That cold start in 2024, the fluky touchdown surge, the rise of Isaiah Likely, and the overall dip in reliability all point to one thing. Andrews might not be the fantasy asset he once was. And in this game, you got to stay ahead of the trends, not stuck in the past. So what about you? Do you still trust Mark Andrews as your T1 this season? Or is it time to pivot and look for upside elsewhere? Either way, the season's right around the corner. And decisions like this one can be the difference between dominating week 1 or scrambling to catch up. One thing's for sure, in Baltimore, nothing's guaranteed.
And if you, just like me, are passionate about the world of football and want to learn more about the Ravens' legacy, don't leave this video without sharing it with that friend who is also a Baltimore Ravens fan and will love this content. See those video suggestions on your screen? The first one was handpicked just for you, and the other is a recommendation from YouTube itself. See you there, and until the next video, go Flock.